There is a moment in every great power confrontation where the side that initiates the action discovers that what it intended to project as strength has instead revealed the precise coordinates of its own vulnerability. The United States imposed a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz to demonstrate decisive military resolve. But what that blockade has shown, with a clarity no adversary could have engineered more effectively, is exactly where American strategic power ends and Chinese strategic power begins. I'm Bradford Analysis, and today we are going to examine what that means. Because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not a story about maritime enforcement. It is a story about the live construction of a new global order. And the architect of that construction did not need a single weapon to begin building it. Let's start with the Star Rich, because the Star Rich is where the entire strategic logic of this confrontation comes into focus. A Chinese-linked tanker, previously sanctioned by the United States, operating in waters where the most powerful naval force in human history was positioned to enforce American policy. And it passed through. The military analysts will debate the operational specifics, a gap in naval coverage, a command decision to avoid a direct incident with China over a single commercial vessel, rules of engagement with carve-outs for civilian shipping. None of those explanations change what the world observed. A sanctioned vessel linked to China moving through an American blockade, without being stopped, without being boarded, without consequence. In every capital watching this confrontation, the perception being formed is identical. The blockade has a limit. That limit is China. And China just demonstrated it publicly, deliberately, and without cost. Understand what that single transit represents. This is not a story about one ship. This is a carefully chosen, carefully executed, and carefully publicized signal that tells every government on Earth exactly what the real value of an American blockade of the world's most critical energy corridor is when China decides it is not going to comply. In great power competition, perception frequently matters more than operational reality. China did not need to defeat the United States Navy in the Strait of Hormuz. It needed one tanker, one transit, and one news cycle. It now has all three. Now look at the diplomatic triangle that China constructed simultaneously. Because the Star Rich transit and the diplomatic offensive are not separate events, they are coordinated movements in a single strategic operation. The UAE meeting, Spain, Lavrov. Three engagements that together span Gulf energy security, European institutional legitimacy, and Eurasian strategic weight. Three meetings that are not commenting on the crisis. They are building something structural, something designed to outlast the crisis and define the post-crisis order. Start with the UAE. China received Emirati officials, while the American blockade of the strait, through which UAE energy exports must pass, is actively generating economic disruption. The message Beijing is sending to Abu Dhabi is specific and consequential. We see your vulnerability. We oppose the action creating it. And we are positioning ourselves as the relationship that will protect your economic interests going forward. The UAE hosts American military installations. It has deep financial integration with the American system. But its economic survival depends on unobstructed access through the Strait of Hormuz. When the country controlling that obstruction is the United States and the country offering diplomatic opposition is China, the Emirati calculus about its long-term security interests begins to shift at the margins. And marginal shifts in Gulf state alignment carry enormous consequences for American strategic positioning in the region. Then Spain, a NATO member, a founding state of the European Union. Its prime minister traveled to Beijing to emphasize alignment around international law and to encourage China to play a stronger role in a multipolar world order. Read that sentence carefully. A NATO ally publicly validating China's position that the American blockade violates international law, that a multipolar order welcoming Chinese influence is preferable to American unilateral dominance. This is not a break with NATO, but it is a European government inserting itself into a conversation happening in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris about what America's retreat from the rules-based norms it claims to defend means for European interests. China is positioning itself as the defender of the very international legal principles the United States is currently violating, and Spain is the signal to every other allied government that public dissent from American policy has European legitimacy and European company. Then Lavrov. Russia and China are not formal treaty allies, but they are coordinating the strategic management of a conflict that both see as an opportunity to demonstrate the limits of American power and accelerate the transition toward a multipolar order. Together, these three meetings span every pillar of a coalition that is not being formally announced but is being actively constructed. A coalition defined not by treaty but by a shared interest in demonstrating that unilateral American action on critical global commons can be challenged, resisted, and ultimately reversed. China's foreign ministry called the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible. Analyze those words with precision. Dangerous is a legal and strategic claim. It invokes directly the framework of the UN Charter, under which the United States claims to operate. China is positioning American policy as a violation of the foundational principles of the international order, principles China now claims to defend with greater fidelity than their original author. Irresponsible is a reputational claim aimed at the global South, at non-aligned states, at countries that have spent decades receiving lectures from Washington about rules and responsible behavior. China is telling those governments that the United States is not a responsible steward of global commons. And that message, delivered from Beijing with the credibility of Chinese economic relationships, lands differently than it would from any other source. The target audience is not Washington. Washington will not change its policy because Beijing calls it irresponsible. The target audience is every government between Washington and Beijing that has not yet decided which side it is on. Now look at the energy economics, because the energy economics explain why the diplomatic pressure is structurally different from anything China has attempted before. The United States does not significantly depend on Gulf oil imports. American energy production has restructured its import dependence over the last 15 years. When Washington imposes a blockade at Hormuz, the American economy does not immediately feel consequences that generate domestic political pressure. The economies that immediately feel those consequences are India, Japan, South Korea, and European states, American allies, whose political support underwrites the legitimacy of American military operations. These are the countries whose populations experience energy price shocks within weeks of a sustained disruption. Inflation, transport costs, manufacturing input costs, heating costs for ordinary citizens who have no strategic interest in the conflict with Iran and no tolerance for bearing its economic burden. The leaders of those countries are managing an impossible situation. They cannot publicly break with Washington without consequences for their security relationships, but they cannot absorb sustained energy shocks without consequences for their own domestic political survival. The pressure they are applying through private channels, pressure that will never appear in a press release, but that shapes every operational decision the American military makes in the Gulf, is already significant and growing. China understands this pressure structure completely. Its diplomatic offensive is designed in part to give those governments political cover to push back against the blockade without formally breaking their alliance relationships. When the Spanish Prime Minister travels to Beijing and endorses international law over American unilateralism, he is signaling to every other allied government that dissent from American policy has legitimacy and has European company. So where does this confrontation actually go? 3 honest trajectories. First, the blockade holds, but at accelerating cost. American naval forces maintain physical control of the strait. Chinese tankers attempting transit face increasing enforcement pressure. The diplomatic cost to American alliances accumulates. Gulf states communicate their discomfort through private channels. The Dior post-crisis order looks significantly more multipolar than the pre-crisis order, with China claiming credit for defending international law. Second, the blockade produces a direct naval incident between the United States and China. An assertive Chinese transit attempt creates a confrontation that demands an American decision. Enforce the blockade against a Chinese vessel and risk direct confrontation, or stand down and publicly confirm that the blockade does not apply to Chinese shipping. Neither option is acceptable. Both are now on the table. A direct naval incident between American and Chinese forces in the Strait of Hormuz would be the most dangerous event of this conflict, bringing the two largest nuclear powers into direct kinetic contact over a choke point neither can afford to lose. Third, economic pressure forces a modification of American policy before military escalation does. Energy price shocks are hitting Allied economies, amplified by Chinese diplomatic pressure, giving Allied governments legitimacy to push back, produce a quiet narrowing of what is actually being stopped. Energy flows partially resume, while the political claim that the blockade remains in force is maintained. China claims victory through multilateral pressure. Washington claims that modified enforcement represents policy as designed. The strategic reality that China successfully challenged unilateral American action on a critical global waterway is understood by every government watching. Here is what you need to understand about what China has done this week. China did not fire a single shot. It did not send a warship to confront the United States Navy. It did not issue a military threat or a formal ultimatum. China sent a tanker, held 3 diplomatic meetings, and issued a press statement calling American policy irresponsible. And in doing so, China has potentially inflicted more damage on American strategic positioning in the Middle East and the broader global order than Iran has managed with its entire ballistic missile arsenal. Because China has revealed in a way that cannot be concealed or explained away that American power over global commons has a limit. And that limit is not imposed through military resistance. It is imposed through economic interdependence, diplomatic legitimacy, and the simple reality that a blockade which cannot be enforced against the world's second-largest economy is not a blockade. It is a performance. The United States entered the Strait of Hormuz to project strength. What it has projected instead is the precise location of its constraint. In 21st century strategic competition, knowing where your adversary's constraint lies is worth more than almost any military capability. China now knows it. And more importantly, the entire world now knows that China knows it. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential great power confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The next 72 hours are critical. Before I close, the question for today, for those who have stayed with me to the end. China used 1 tanker, 3 diplomatic meetings, and a press statement to potentially expose the operational limits of the most powerful naval blockade in modern history. No shots fired, no formal ultimatum, no military escalation, just strategic patience, economic leverage, and diplomatic coordination. Which trajectory do you think is most likely? Option A, the blockade holds, and Washington absorbs the diplomatic cost, betting that physical control of the strait outweighs the reputational damage of a blockade China has shown it can selectively defy. Option B, a direct naval incident forces an American decision that no administration could win cleanly, either enforcing against China and risking escalation, or standing down and publicly confirming the blockade's limits. Option C, economic pressure from allied governments, amplified by Chinese diplomatic cover, produces a quiet policy modification that both sides claim as a victory, while the strategic verdict is understood by everyone watching. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know how you are reading this from where you are. This has been Bradford Analysis. Share this if you think someone in your network needs this context. Subscribe so you don't miss the next analysis. This story moves faster than any analysis can keep up with. And when new developments break, Bradford Analysis will be here to walk through them with you.